Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's SANS webcast, SANS 2024 Threat Hunting Survey, Hunting for Normal Within Chaos, sponsored by Carbon Black, Cisco, Corelight, Cyborg Security, Hyas, Lacework, Rapid7, and Splunk. My name is Mary Lynn Gollier of SANS. Today's featured speakers are Matt Fuchs, SANS Certified Instructor and Author. Josh Lemon, SANS Certified Instructor and Author. John Gamble, Senior Director of Product Marketing at Corelight. Adam Lopez, Director of Solutions Engineering at Hyas. And David Bianco, Staff Security Strategist at Splunk. If during the webcast you have any questions for our presenters, please enter them into the Slack workspace or Zoom Q&A window at any time. Please note that this webcast is being recorded, and a copy of the slides and recording of this webcast will be available for viewing later today and can be found on the SANS registration page. And with that, I'd like to hand the webcast over to our presenters.
Thank you very much, Marilyn, and good morning or good evening or good very early morning, depending on where you are in the different parts of the world. And if you're actually watching this back after it's been run live, thank you very much for watching it back, and we appreciate you kind of spending some time and listening through it today. As Marilyn mentioned, you have Matt Fuchs and myself this morning just to start off a little bit and talk a little bit about the threat hunting survey and the results that we saw this year. Feel free to drop questions in the discussion channel inside of Slack. I just had the Slack link up on screen, which I'll put back up there again for all of you. So feel free to drop questions in there for either myself or Matt, and also our other presenters as well that will be coming on shortly also. Remember, we do have a panel session at the end, so we'll take what you've put in that discussion channel, and then we'll also discuss that amongst the rest of our panelists and then kind of open that up for a bit of discussion as well. Just a reminder, if you are using Slack today, please remember to be respectful of everyone in Slack. It's important that it is an informative discussion and a very sort of practical and useful discussion around what we're sort of talking about today. But the one thing we do ask from a SANS point of view is that you're respectful of everyone's views inside of there, so that it acts as a useful forum for us to discuss interesting concepts and interesting ideas that might affect our industry at large, so that we can kind of all learn from that and grow from that as well. All right, with that, I'll hand it over to Matt a little bit to give a little bit of an intro around what we're going to do today and start to kick this off, and then I'll come back and chat with all of you as well.
Thank you very much, Josh. I know it's very hard for you, very late at night. That's always hard when you're down under, right?
It is a little bit.
We have a very hard combination for the threat hunting. So
yeah, it is a little early in the morning for me, for those listening in. I think we're just gone past 1:30 in the morning, which is a lovely hour. So I've got a good cup of tea here to kind of keep me going.
Okay. Yeah, so like Josh already pointed out, we're going to go through the results of the survey or some key points of the results. It's a little bit longer, that survey, so we can't discuss everything in the 30 minutes. Then John Gamble will talk about expanding visibility. As we know from the last few years when we did this threat hunting survey, visibility is one of the core things that we need for threat hunting as well as for incident response. If we can see it, we can really fight it. That's important. Then we look a little bit into threat hunting techniques with Adam Lopez, particularly about adversary infrastructure. And Dave Bianco will talk about hunting and hunting frameworks that help you to organize your threat hunts. So I'm really looking forward to these talks too. Could you advance the slides, Josh, please? Josh is in control today. So looking at the demographics, the point that is very interesting for us is not necessarily only which industries people are in. So we're looking for a global stretch of our respondents. That's important because Obviously, from an attacker perspective, the global attacks are similar to a point. So there's not so much deviation in the ways that we should work. The other thing that we're interested in, that we get the two angles of a threat hunting operation, which is on one at the technical part, and on the other hand, the management part. Basically, the people who decide if threat hunting is worth anything, the people who decide if they're going to spend money on it in the future, if they buy us our new tools that make a lot of fun. And then again, we are also looking into sizes, into the organizational sizes, because there is no one size fit, no one solution fits it all, right? A small organization might have other opportunities in how they do their threat hunts than large organizations that are multinationals, where the networks are usually getting a little bit more complex, which makes visibility in turn more complex. And so I think we do have a quite good mix again this year. We have a lot of industries that we're interested in. We have those high-tech industries. We do have a good mix of geography. So we have all the continents, at least the ones that are not super cold. So Antarctica is still something we're missing. We're working on that for next year, maybe. We have all the organization sizes across. And we do have, when you look at the top 4 roles that are represented, number 1 is clearly security administrators and analysts, but in number 2, we already have business managers. So that should ensure that we do see both sides of this coin. We see the technical side and we see the management side as well. So let's see what the key takeaways are that we got out of the information that you sent to us.
Yeah, so this year, some interesting takeaways that we found in a lot of the survey results that came back were here. I'm going to quickly run through some of these, but I do encourage you to get a hold of the actual paper itself. It's published and it's live online at the moment, so you can actually read through why some of these were kind of key findings rather than also just seeing the stats behind it. One of the interesting things we asked this year was around what is the kind of most common threat actor that we have threat hunters find in the past year. And the most common one came out as BEC type threat actors, with 68% identifying that as the most common threat actor. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute, or Matt will talk a little bit more about that shortly. But it was kind of an interesting thing to see what is it that people are actually catching when they go looking for threats inside their environment. We also saw half of our organizations have formally defined threat hunting methodologies. Again, we'll kind of look at some of the summary results for this as well as we kind of talk through the overview this morning. But this is a significant increase, which is really wonderful to see, and also kind of reinforces that organizations are starting to formalize and build these repeatable processes as well. We again looked at organizations that utilize outsourcing for threat hunting. It's kind of an interesting question that we ask around this, because it helps us understand a little bit about, are organizations using their internal staff who we would sort of expect to really know the environment well, or are organizations having to outsource threat hunting because they either don't have the skills, or they don't have the staff, or they just don't have the time to actually go through that. And again, we'll look at some of that this morning, and also how that has changed a little bit over time as well. We're seeing 51% of organizations have developed clearly defined methodologies, which is really good. We're seeing 64% of organizations starting to formally measure the success of effectiveness as well. Again, a nice kind of increase, and we kind of have started to see things like the adoption of methodologies and the use of methodologies. As that increases, also so does this sort of ability to be able to formally measure success, which makes sense. If we've got a repeatable process, it becomes a lot easier to actually measure that. We're also seeing almost half, we're seeing 47% of organizations basically be influenced by what resources from a human perspective they actually have to go and do threat hunting, and that is starting to influence the methodologies that they're actually using for threat hunting as well. I mean, that kind of makes sense practically when you think about it. If you don't have people to implement the methodology, then of course there's no kind of point writing that methodology. But on the other side of that, I guess, sort of coin, is that you often want to write a kind of robust methodology for threat hunting, and then try to see what you have available to kind of meet that methodology, as opposed to kind of getting a methodology that is influenced by resources, or whether it be human or whether it be technical inside the environment. We're also asked a couple of questions this year around where organizations collect threat intelligence from. Now, this survey is not a threat intelligence survey. It's around threat hunting, but to be able to effectively threat hunt, you need useful threat intelligence to influence what you might go looking for in the environment, or things that you want to try to find, or how you might build a scenario that you want to go and look for. So essentially, if you're looking for a threat actor that is doing things like altering forwarding rules in email, which would be kind of typical of BEC, what threat intelligence is there that exists around the ways that threat actors are doing that? And then how do I go looking for that in the environment? So threat intelligence forms a really kind of important part to threat hunting, because without useful threat intelligence, or threat intelligence that's relevant to our organization, it kind of makes it hard to go and perform sort of that narrow threat hunt, to go looking for threat actors that might really be relevant to your organization. So we asked some questions around this, around sort of where people are getting threat intelligence from, or how they are developing threat intelligence. And this is where this kind of stat comes from, in terms of 30% of respondents are using vendor information as a bit of fallback to their own threat intelligence that they might be developing internally. And then also we see 14%, which is pretty low in the grand scheme of the organizations that responded, but 14% are relying entirely on vendor threat intelligence. And the reason that Matt and I kind of find that interesting is because the best threat intelligence that you can kind of have is threat intelligence from existing incidents inside your organization. And when you start to use, I guess, sort of vendor threat intelligence, which can still be really useful, it can start to be more generic to other organizations, because that obviously is threat intelligence from other incidents that have occurred in other organizations. So it's kind of an interesting little statistic to see how that's kind of worked. The other part too that we asked about is around who is contributing to threat hunting, and who is contributing to the development of threat hunting as well. And it's nice that we're seeing incident response teams are starting to get a larger contribution to the threat hunting methodologies. So we're seeing that slowly start to increase from what it was last year. So about 32% of organizations are using the incident response team to kind of contribute to those threat hunting methodologies. Again, why this is important is because the best threat hunting is usually influenced by the best threat intelligence, and your incident responders, which are at the cold face of dealing with active threats inside the environment, can obviously provide really useful contributions to your organization to develop that methodology. All right, with that, let's dive into some of the detail before I get too carried away and talk about all of these in one slide. So I'll hand over to Matt, who's going to talk through a little bit around how we hunt and what we find.
Yeah, that's always a very difficult topic, because one thing is how we hunt and how that affects what we find, because those things obviously affect each other, right? And the third thing is what happens in reality. Those things also don't need to match fully all the time, right? But the first concerning thing that I actually see in there, the first question that I would have when I look at the numbers, is basically we see in position number 1, business email compromise, and in position number 2, ransomware. And both of those things are kind of attacks that also have the ability to, well, basically inform the company that that hack happened without setting off any security alerts. So for instance, ransomware is something that doesn't try to be undetected, at least when it fires, right? Then they want to be detected. I mean, sometimes we today have ransomware incidents where they mainly exfiltrate data and only encrypt a few machines just to make the company aware of their presence, right? Rather than encrypting large amounts of machines, because they know companies have good backups now. So the encryption part is not really threatening. So the exfiltration part is the thing they're going to go for. Business email compromise, same thing. You could have a lot of detections going off on the financial side of the companies. So when you lose money because they are kind of interjecting into that money flow, you know, by sending out wrong IBANs and stuff, those are also things that you detect eventually. So both of those threat actors that run those schemes, they will be detected eventually anyhow, right? Without cybersecurity whatsoever, because that is based on what they do. So the question is, if the detection rate is that high because they get detected that easily early on, or if it's that high because, well, you detect them anyhow, because if you can't work because everything is down in your company, well, that's, I would call it detection too. It's just not the intended way to detect them, right? It's detection, security detection by availability management, pretty much, which is, by the way, something that happens very often, that availability management catches something before security operations catches that. The other thing here is also we have different components, as most organizations, or a huge number of organizations, moved into the cloud. And that makes business email compromise also a cloud problem to some point. And that also influences how we can hunt there. And that is going back to the question how we hunt. Because while we can do quite a lot of things in your local network, you can control whatever you want, right? In the cloud, it falls back on what the vendor gives to you. And one of the interesting points there that we could see pretty much by the end of last year was when Microsoft announced the breach. One of the reaction was that they increased the retention time for their logs and the depth of their logs that they would provide to their clients, which kind of shows you how dependent you are on those logs. The good news regarding that is for Microsoft 365, which is, well, probably having the biggest market share in Office applications out there and in hosted Exchange applications. They do offer you quite some useful APIs. They offer you quite some useful logs to investigate those business email compromises and to also hunt for them. And thirdly, to also prevent them. So hunting in business email compromises is good. But on the other hand, the turnaround time for business email compromises is oftentimes very short. We're talking about days or weeks until there is damage. Same for ransomware, right? And that is kind of a problem for hunting operations, especially, if you only hunt every now and then a couple of times a year, you might not spot that at all, right? We did have some breaches in my teams last year where attackers were in the network or in the mailboxes for a very long time, and they didn't do any harm in that time, didn't succeed. Well, then you can kick them out, but very often it's just too late. And that brings me down to the lower numbers here, and that is where I totally like to see numbers like 38%. So that we see 38% in the nation state department there, because those attackers are different than the other two. They intend to stay stealthy for a long time, right? So that's very different. And that means that is where threat hunting can also give you quite a huge chance to catch them, because when they are there for long. The same thing goes for criminal industrial espionage and all the things that are in between, right? So today we also see a lot of organizations, nation state organizations, that are in the criminal industrial espionage part rather than anything else. So when we think about North Korea and so on, they're a nation state, but they act like criminals very often in that regard. So those things, those borders, I mean, they mix up very well. And I'm not sure what all the others are. We did get some comments, but I think that the main takeaways here is that threat hunting is something that helps organizations. And if the numbers for the first two here go for early detections before anything big happened, then it's totally worth the while, right? Because the damages there are super big. And when you can catch them before they do any harm, you are really better off. And how do you do that? And that is something that we try to make clear on the next slide, or to figure out on the next slide. And you gave us the information for that. How do you stay up to date? As Josh already pointed out, we are strongly dependent on threat intelligence, because we need to figure out how to build our hunts, right? So what is our risk profile? So what can our adversaries do? What are their options? What are their capabilities? What do they want from us? And for that, threat intel is very important, and it needs to be up-to-date threat intel. As Josh said, the best breaches to learn from are your own. If you don't have your own, I think the next best thing is your peers in the industry, because those breaches and the goals that the attackers have might be very similar to the ones that attackers that attack you might have. And only then you have all that outside intelligence, right? And as we can see again, and Josh pointed it out, number one is clearly vendor blocks and papers. Mainly that might be because they are very easy to access. They are very well promoted. So there's never a day where I don't get an email from a vendor where they have some new intel that they want to share. So it's way more than I can digest in any way. It's just too much, right? Independent blocks and papers. Well, the question is, how do you judge if it's independent or not so independent? That's always tough to say. But at least blocks and papers that seem to be independent, that is also making up a huge portion there. The question is always, what kind of insight does the author have into the particular threat profile and risk profile that your company is concerned with? Then at 55%, we have the commercial intelligence providers, and that is a mix of more strategical intelligence versus real indicators that you ingest. So it's a huge mix, and that might also make up the larger number. What surprised me this year, and what surprised me very much, is that we have 50% of our respondents doing their own research. That is way more than expected. So if you would have asked me beforehand, I would have said maybe 25%, and that's already on the high side. And then it came back with 50%, and that is very interesting, right? Because that means when you look at the demographics of our survey, that means that we also have mid-sized companies, at least, and maybe even small-sized companies doing their own research. And that's cool, because that will further the whole industry very quickly. Then we have OSINT providers. OSINT is great, but very often it's old, right? Once it makes it into the OSINT world, it might already be old, but that doesn't mean it's not valuable, because very often attackers don't change, particularly ransomware actors don't change too much what they do and what they use. So we even had samples that were used in like 3-4 attacks over a couple of months. Same samples, even same hash. It happens every now and then. Governmental organizations, that is something that is hard to judge, because that might change across different countries. Some countries are better at that. They have better departments that notify their industries about imminent breaches and stuff. Some countries are worse, right? So that is what probably many of you experience when you are working in multiple regions, that some regions, or the government in some regions, is more helpful in them and less helpful in others. And that allows me to hand over to Josh again.
Thank you. Also, just a reminder that there is a competition running inside of Slack, so do make sure you join the Slack channel. I believe the information has been put back into the webinar chat as well, just so you can see the link to get in there. But I know that they're doing some competitions in there as well if you want to join in with those. All right, so looking at threat hunting methodologies, I'll kind of speed along here so we don't run too slow on time. But one thing that we have started to do over the years that Matt and I have been authoring this paper is we've started to track better changes over years, because we kind of find that trend change really interesting to find out what's happening inside of our industry. So a couple of kind of key things here. The graph on the left-hand side, where we start to ask organizations if they are using a clearly defined methodology to do threat hunting. So we've seen, again, a big increase between last year to this year around people who are doing formally defined threat hunting methodologies. And again, I think that also then comes out in some of the metrics we're going to look at in a moment as well. We have seen a decrease in those that are defining their own methodology, but it's more ad hoc, which is wonderful, given that we are seeing an increase in the formal measuring as well. On the right-hand side here, it's a look at how often people are reviewing their threat hunting methodologies. And this is important because technology changes, as Matt just mentioned there, even with sort of the increased use in the cloud, that is kind of one part of changing in technology, but also how we're using those parts of the technology, with people going from virtual machines in the cloud to containers inside of the cloud. And how does that change your risk profile and sort of your, I guess, sort of the landscape of what you have to defend from an organization. Now, although the large portion is still whenever we need for this year being a little over 35%, it is decreasing year on year. And that's a good sign. We are seeing a move away from a more ad hoc change to methodologies to people kind of a big increase to looking at that from a monthly basis, which is really good. We probably think that's a little bit too fast, and we give a little bit of commentary on that inside the paper as well. We're seeing people kind of increasing doing that quarterly, which is a pretty reasonable move with reviewing that methodology, and then also people doing it annually as well, although that has shifted down a little bit. Doing it annually or quarterly is probably suitable for most organizations when it comes to building a methodology, particularly if you've kind of thought out that methodology. I guess the only reason to kind of move that faster would be if tooling has changed, or if you built that methodology with a lot of constraints wrapped around it. You could start to open it up as, I guess, sort of tooling or funding or resourcing kind of changes with inside of your team. After that, we start to look at what organizations have done outsourcing for threat hunting. Again, as I mentioned at the start with, this is interesting because when people outsource threat hunting, they're kind of putting it back in the hands of someone that might not know their IT environment as well as the organization itself does. And I guess from Matt and my perspective, that's kind of interesting move because it often means that you spend a fair amount of time as the outsource provider coming in to sort of understand that landscape as well. And the other challenge you could have, and it's something that we kind of thought about adding for future years, is do you use the same outsource provider year on year? So if you do, you kind of then have a bit of, I guess, sort of inherent knowledge with that outsource provider, or are people kind of shopping around and using different providers as well, which may make it hard for a brand new provider to kind of understand your threat landscape. Interestingly, we saw a big jump of that in the results for this year. We did see that kind of trend down, which we were kind of pretty excited about because people were bringing that in-house and bringing resources internally and training people up and allowing them to understand the environment. But there was a big shift to that moving to an outsourced provider this year. Now, we kind of speculated around this. I mean, from a cybersecurity perspective, there's not probably a huge reason for that. Maybe this is more of an economic reason with economic changes inside of a lot of organizations and a lot of countries kind of shifting staff or kind of sort of altering their budgets internally as well. And that might explain why people are starting to outsource this. They may just not have the staff internally to look at it as much. But again, we talk about some of that inside of the paper as well. So go and download that and take a bit of a look at it. In terms of things like formally measuring threat hunting, again, we saw a huge increase this year to those who are formally measuring threat hunting. And this kind of does align a fair amount with those that are now doing things like have formal methodologies for threat hunting as well. Again, we saw a big increase of that. To kind of remind you that the numbers were actually very, very similar in terms of last year to this year, in terms of those that had developed methodologies formally. And we're seeing the same in terms of those that are measuring success and effectiveness, because obviously that becomes a lot easier if you have a methodology to actually measure that against. So that might explain why we're seeing that big increase. But this is important because it shows organizations how important threat hunting can be. And we do also look at that in the paper. We won't get time to talk about that today, but we do look at that in the paper in terms of where organizations are seeing success when they are doing that measurement and how much success they are seeing in those different areas as well. And that's great. I mean, the short version of the story is those that measure it see a significant amount of success, and some see some really big success in different areas because they are doing threat hunting and how that kind of improves overall security inside of their environment, not just improving catching threat actors, but improving other things like better detections or better configurations or stronger configurations inside their environment. So there's lots of these kind of really good beneficial fallouts from doing threat hunting and being able to measure that as well. And with that, I'll kind of hand over to Matt to do a quick talk of some of the takeaways we found in the paper this year.
Yeah, let's do a very quick one. We don't have that much time left. So first of all, what we saw is that a lot of organizations, the small majority of organizations are working on their contextual awareness. And that's super important that you get the full picture when you threat hunt. Otherwise, you might draw the wrong conclusions and steer the ship into the wrong directions. What could help there, and what also 47% plan to incorporate, is machine learning and artificial intelligence into the tools. That might also help addressing a few of those things. So that also involves a lot of investment. Obviously, when we're talking about new tools, more sophisticated threat hunts, that costs money, that's for sure. And organizations today have found that threat hunting is worth the efforts, so they're gonna put the money into that. So we don't probably gonna lose a lot of resources that we already have in threat hunting. So we don't have those limitations, The only limitation is staff. So everyone who tries to hire right now incident responder, threat hunters, it's really difficult to get them. Tools help us very much in many regards, but usually they first start helping us out on the lower tier levels of a SOC and not on the high tier levels with threat hunters and incident responders. That's going to remain a big problem. I'm pretty sure about that for the next few years, because AI, machine learning, all of that usually starts at the bottom of the pyramid and not at the top where we need them. That's the problem. Josh, do you have anything to add that I forgot about?
No, I think that, I mean, you kind of touched on that well in terms of that kind of skills shortage as well. But also, one thing that's really important for people to understand is that even with things like new AI and ML kind of getting pushed into tools, there is also this concept of having skilled people that know how to drive them and ask the right questions or to feed the right data into those tools. I guess kind of the interesting takeaway that I kind of saw is that although people are kind of planning to incorporate kind of these new tools and technologies, as we've seen kind of throughout many, many years now, Matt, that those tools are only as good as the people that are actually at the other end driving those tools or feeding those tools.
Yeah, I'm usually saying that differently, right?
Yeah, you are. You've usually got a lot more color in it. But given it's recorded today, I'm not going to
Yeah.
repeat what you normally say
Yeah.
there.
It's in the
Although,
survey, in the last
yeah,
year's survey at least.
that's right. That's right. I think there was a nice call out of it in last year's survey. If those of you who go back and have a bit of a read of it. All right. With that, we have John Gamble coming up. So I'll hand over to John to do a little bit of introduction to himself, and we'll hand control over to you as well, John. So you'll be able to take control and start to run through the slides. As always, feel free to kind of ask questions. If there's anything that John kind of misses, don't worry about that. We'll try and roll those back into the panel session right at the end. I'll check with you, John, that we can hear you and see you.
How can you hear me now?
Perfect. Yes, I can see you and hear you. I'll hand it over to you. Thanks very much.
Wonderful. Thank you, Josh. Thank you, Matt and SANS for having us back. We're happy to be sponsoring the survey again. Some great results this year. Really interesting to see some of the needle movement and some of the survey results. I'm John Gamble. I'm at Corelight. I've spent my whole career in cybersecurity across endpoint, network, identity, a whole kind of range of disciplines. And I love talking about threat hunting. I love meeting threat hunters and future threat hunters as well. And if I'm going to take the next 15 minutes and kind of leave you with something, it's an impression of the role that the network can play in your threat hunting operation and journey, and the importance of visibility, right? We saw some of this in the survey results, which I'm going to talk about in a few slides. But visibility is where threat hunting really starts. We like to say it's the threat hunting ground is built on visibility, and the network has a really important role to play in that. And so that's kind of what I want to take you through in these next 15 minutes and look at some of the survey results and kind of discuss how that relates to this topic. So first, kind of a quick slide here. You may have seen something that looks like this before. Some call it the SOC visibility triad. I just like to call it, a great essential set of tools for threat hunting. The network is a great source for visibility breadth, and the endpoint is a great source for depth. We love to say that internally, and many people say that outside of our company as well. The network is really great at helping you see the forest for the trees, right? Zooming out, big picture, patterns, change over time. But if a particular tree in the forest is on fire or there's a problem with it, you're going to want to double click on it, and that's the endpoint. And it's those two really fundamental complementary sources of visibility that can give you a much more holistic and contextual picture of what the heck is happening. And of course, ideally, you're able to centralize that, right, in a single kind of source of truth that's accessible to your team. Namely, a SIM is what we see in terms of design pattern, but it doesn't have to be. We see other organizations that are using custom data lake tools or using other tools and getting data into it. Wherever you're able to consolidate and kind of see both sides of this coin, you're going to have hunting ground, which is kind of the starting place if you're going to be able to affect threat hunt. This is a diagram that kind of shows some of the 5 axes that we think about internally when we think about threat hunting program maturity. But for the purposes of the next couple minutes and today's discussion, I really just want to focus on 2, right? I want to focus on data and people and processes, right? And the reason is because, as we saw in the survey result, right, these were number 1 and number 2 biggest cited challenges, right, in unlocking threat hunting capabilities in organizations. Number 1 was, of course, staff, right? while reduced, right? That's great. That's a positive, change, I would say, year-over-year survey result, right? Last year it was nearly 3 and 4 people, right? We're saying, gosh, I can't find anybody. Less this year, but still very high, right? Half of organizations are reporting this is their number one challenge, followed by data, right? Data quality, data availability, data standardization, right? The number 2 cited challenge by organizations in the survey is around data quality. So I really want to kind of zero in on these 2 things and kind of walk you through some of our thoughts about how the network can help you in these dimensions. So let's start with the second, data maturity. Again, I think we saw, a 30% year-over-year increase here in terms of reporting of data being a challenge, right? That's not a good thing, in my opinion. It signals to me that organizations are dealing with technology as it is, which is ever expanding, ever changing, ever growing, right? Of course, and I don't like to see this result, but it's not surprising to me, right? Cloud footprints are growing at astronomical rates. There's all sorts of new devices and connectivity that's happening. Network and organizational footprints tend to expand if you're in a growing business. So it's not surprising to me that this has increased year over year as a problem for organizations. And you have, almost half of organizations now reporting that quality or quantity is kind of the primary problem here, and about a third reporting that it's a lack of data standards, right? And this axis that you see here on the bottom right is kind of a way to think about data maturity. It's how we talk about data maturity in terms of threat hunting, and it starts on the left side, right? Ad hoc visibility, right? Basically, grab the visibility that you can, right? Wherever it's available, try to get it. It's better than nothing, but the challenges are, right, it tends to be unstructured and full of gaps and hard to get, reliably into a central source of truth. And then you switch all the way to the far end of the maturity spectrum on data, and you're looking at an advanced data maturity model for threat hunting programs where visibility is actually architected. Now, that's a luxury that many security teams don't have, but it is a destination worth aiming for. And we do see organizations that have achieved it. And what, architect visibility can look like is, a design pattern for security visibility that is standardized and agreed upon by an organization, which means every time a new data center spins up or office gets opened or you name it, this visibility and data design pattern that the security team needs to do their job is already deployed because that's a standard that's been architected. And, in that perfect world, and again, I realize the challenges inside of security teams these days with budget, staff, tooling, et cetera. But that single data lake, right? That promise of that one source of truth where you can go and see all of your alerts, see all of your logs, all in one place. I have seen some organizations achieve that. It's obviously very expensive in some cases, but certainly consolidation at the far end of the spectrum is a good signal of data maturity here. Now the network, right? One of the challenges with the network is that a lot of the sources, standard sources of network visibility that security teams rely on today, especially for threat hunting, they weren't in most cases designed for security use cases, right? I sometimes call them IT exhaust. The idea there being that a lot of the logs that you're getting off of network infrastructure were originally and fundamentally designed for IT and networking team use cases, right? The data in those sources of telemetry is for debugging, tuning, troubleshooting, right? Packet drop analysis, right? That was kind of the primary use case in many cases, not all, but most. And security teams grab them because they're available, which is great. Some visibility is certainly better than no visibility. But weren't built for security use cases, which means they're often missing certain layers of data that you might want in a security context for a particular part of your organization. And these sources of data don't necessarily talk well together, right? Time stamping, right? Suddenly you're trying to correlate this log over here from this server and this log over here, and the UTC time format's off, and now you're out of luck, right? They weren't designed to interconnect and interrelate. And look, you can definitely threat hunt on these sources of information. I'm not here to tell you can't, and we see many organizations doing it. NetFlow, for example, can certainly be a useful piece of information in a threat hunt. But I am saying that it's challenging, and that the organizations we see that have progressed along the data maturity journey of threat hunting typically start here and evolve beyond it, because there is a better alternative than playing this kind of what I like to call a bad puzzle game where half the puzzle pieces are missing and the ones you have don't necessarily fit together well. it's okay if you're starting there. And if that's what you've got today, there's certainly productive threat hunting capabilities you can build on top of this network visibility. But I would encourage you to think about your next step in your journey of data maturity. And we're going to talk about that in a second. Well, you might be asking, what could be a solution here, right? What could we do to address that? This is a quote I like. It's from almost a decade ago, but it's still very relevant. Rob Joyce, who at the time was the head of the TAO group, which is the Tailored Access Operations Group, the offensive cyber branch of the U.S. kind of military. So these guys are basically red team, right? In this scenario, he was asked, "Hey, what keeps you up at night in terms of your team's kind of objectives that would threaten your objectives?" And he said, "If the other side, the defenders in this case, were holistically monitoring my network, that would keep me up at night because you can't avoid the network. You have to traverse the network at some level in almost every single attack." And he knows that, which is why he said this quote. And I think it's just a powerful illustration of what I'm trying to communicate, which is that the network is a huge source of leverage for teams if they can unlock better network visibility. So a quick kind of example, right, about, well, what's the difference here, right? Well, for example, DNS, right? DNS is prolific. It's, beloved by adversaries because it's a really noisy place to hide and do really bad things like communicate to C2 servers or exfiltrate data. We were talking earlier, I think Josh was mentioning ransomware. DNS is a place adversaries love to hide. And your typical DNS server log is pretty sparse. Again, not really designed for security use cases, but still useful in some cases. What you see on the top there is a Zeek DNS log. And if you've never heard of Zeek, just a quick 101, it's an open source network security monitoring tool. And it can do exactly the thing that you just saw on the previous slide that kept the red team up at night. It's capable of that, holistic network security monitoring across protocols, ports, etc. And that's an example of its DNS log you see there on the top. I'm not going to go through it. We don't have time, but you can already see that it's richer, right? It has more data. It has data that might well be useful, right, in a security investigation context, such as the actual content of what the DNS response got back, which is not always present in a DNS server log. That response can be very, very interesting in some cases during threat hunt investigations. So what can you do? I would recommend deploying a NDR, network detection and response, and/or network visibility solution in your environment to help open that aperture. Start baselining, start understanding your network. If you've seen one network, you've seen one network. There's so much weirdness in everyone's network. It does take time to learn and understand what that looks like. Of course, the end targets here when we're threat hunting, they're typically endpoints, servers, right? Physical assets. Recognize that, but also recognize that, again, forest to the trees, the network is this great place to start. And in fact, many of our organizations and our client base that are pretty advanced in terms of threat hunting to tell us that they typically start from a network perspective in terms of their threat hunts and then rotate and pivot into endpoint level telemetry. So real quick here in our last 5 minutes, let's talk about people and process, right? The other big challenge that was cited in this survey. About half of orgs are using, internal staff. So almost 50% of threat hunting is occurring in-house, which is great. Although we did see a decrease, as Josh and Matt mentioned earlier, year over year, pretty considerable decrease between last year's survey results. We could speculate on why that is, macroeconomic conditions, staffing. It's a challenging world out there, but I think it's still a positive that almost half of organizations are using internal staff, and we've got about a third that are outsourcing to third parties. And you see the same kind of maturity x-axis here at the bottom that we saw on the data side. This is how we kind of think about people and process maturity at Corelight, and when we're talking to customers, at the beginning stage, right? Hunting is something you get assigned on top of your normal day job, right? It's one more thing to your already full plate as a security analyst, and that's great. That's a great place to start. As you move along the spectrum, right, you can get to the kind of the advanced stages, right, where it's actually a team, and that team might not just be hunting for techniques and tactics and procedures. They might actually, at the very far end of the spectrum, literally be hunting for individuals and organizations that they know are attacking their organization. We have seen that sort of behavior at the very, very high end of the spectrum. I'm certainly not here to say that's an accessible thing to all organizations. It's probably not, given staffing and budget, but it is quite a destination to get to if you can ever reach it. And measurement, right? I think we saw some good survey results this year that shows that, program measurement is increasing year over year, which is great, right? Because you've got to ultimately justify threat hunting to your superiors, to your boss, to their bosses, right? Why are we doing this activity that's proactive and we might not find anything? Is that absence of value? Not necessarily. But knowing where to hunt, right, is kind of the hardest part. And, I like to say any security analyst can start threat hunting, right? If they just have the right data and they have a little bit of guidance on where to start looking, especially on the network side. Corelight, we've put out this free resource. It's a 45-page free white paper. It's got technical guidance. It's basically a guidebook about how to threat hunt on the network. And I like to call it our $250,000 thing that we give away for free. I think it's probably more like $1 million asset we give away for free, because it's the distillation of a bunch of really talented and smart people at our company who used to threat hunt or work on the other side for all manner of very large organizations in government and defense and intelligence spaces. And we basically took their brain trust and distilled it into 45 pages of network guidance. And we give it away for free. And so it's a really great resource as you're starting to think about your threat hunting journey. Maybe it's day one, maybe you're more in an intermediate stage, maybe you're advanced. I think there might be something in there for you, and I'd really encourage you to go download it and check it out. It's mapped to MITRE ATT&CK, by the way, so it's a really helpful way for measurement perspective to help you understand what you're looking at on the network. And again, if you have visibility, some form of data visibility today, and you have guidance, i.e. something like our threat hunting guide, you can actually get started today. This is just a quick screenshot of a sample threat hunt that theoretically you could go do with that guide and some data, right? It's a Splunk screenshot you're looking at here. It's got Zeek logs inside of it from Corelight, but you could get it from open source too. And it's basically looking for abnormally long DNS queries, right? DNS queries that are over 25 characters in length. You might be wondering, why would you do that? Well, a threat hunter might have a hypothesis that I think DNS traffic is being abused to possibly exfiltrate data. Back to the ransomware point that was made earlier, because backups are pretty common now, the ransomware actors are switching to data exfiltration and trying to hold data hostage and threatening to leak it. So data exfiltration over DNS is definitely something you want to be paying attention to and possibly hunting against. And this quick query here shows you how you would do that in your SIM. Here it would be Splunk and against logs that you would be generated in a network security monitoring kind of context from a tool like Zeek or Corelight or others. So again, I think any analyst can get started today, as long as your boss is willing to give you a little bit of time dedicated a week. You can start small, you really can. Come up with a couple theses of things you want to look for, set up those queries, set them to run, make it a scheduled thing, come back and look at it a week, 2 weeks later. Maybe you didn't catch anything in your trap. That's okay. The absence of discovery is not lack of value in threat hunting. In fact, what you've done there is disproven a potential for risk in the organization, right? You've established whatever that behavior or thing I was looking for is didn't exist inside of those time period that I looked at it. That's helpful from a risk reduction and knowledge perspective. And, I think, oh, that's my time. I'll wrap up real quick. Look for help too, outside of the security team, I would say as well. Most security teams can't afford somebody with a data science background. That's a pretty sophisticated, highly budgeted thing. But you might be surprised that adjacent orgs in your company are willing to potentially lend you some of the time of their folk with some really interesting challenges, right? Security challenges are fascinating. And there's definitely data science talent in-house at many organizations beyond, a couple hundred employees. There's someone at your organization that might have a data science background that might be willing to add a little bit of responsibility to their job and help you guys out on your hunting journey. Quickly, Corelight, and then I'll turn it back over to the next presenter. We're an open network detection and response vendor, open because we're based on open source. So those deep capabilities you saw, we can certainly help you deliver. I love talking open source, so feel free to ping me afterwards if you have any questions. We can help you with visibility across your network, in the cloud, on-premise, hybrid. We can put it wherever you want. Our SaaS infrastructure, a SIM like Splunk, it's up to you. And yeah, thanks for having me. We really, really appreciated it.
Great. Thank you, John. Welcome, everybody. My name is Adam Lopez. I am the Director of Solutions Engineering with Hyas. I'm going to dive in here and make sure I make the most use of my time, but I first wanted to thank Josh, Matt, and SANS for the opportunity, as well as, this is Hyas's first time sponsoring the webinar, and we're looking forward to many more to come. A little bit more about myself, and then we'll jump right in. So I've been in the security space for the better part of a decade now, and mostly on the SOC, security operations side, both from an IR perspective, threat hunting perspective, but most recently, as you see there, as a solution engineer, and really focused on those aspects of the business. So I'm going to dive in here. Today, we're going to talk about some threat hunting techniques in terms of adversary infrastructure. So, John's talk just recently or previous to mine really dived into visibility into the network. So we're going to assume that you've already kind of have that visibility, and now you're looking at it from the other side, right? So from the adversary infrastructure of what might be out there on the internet from resources and aspects of what threat actors and adversaries are actually own or utilizing to conduct their attacks. So first, I'm going to mention or go over what VRA and what we consider VRA here at Hyas. Leveraging infrastructure knowledge. So what does that mean? And there's some ties there to some of the survey results when it comes to data, right? Lack of accurate data, as well as some visibility aspects. And then I'm going to go over 2 case studies. One actually hits right on a business email compromise attack, and I chose that one specifically because of the survey results and thought it would be, pretty relevant in terms of, what we look at when we're looking at those types of threats. And then we'll go into another case study and then some key takeaways. So VRA, what is VRA? So we consider VRA a framework for utilizing threat hunting techniques as well as methodologies and a way at looking at adversary infrastructure. So verdicts in terms of what are the conclusions of IOCs, right? Are they malicious, benign? Maybe it's based on behavior, context, metadata related to that IOC. R is related infrastructure. So what do we know about related infrastructure when it comes to domains, IP addresses, hashes that are used to launch attacks, or to run C2 servers, or to generate different types of malware. And then actors, right? A lot of times organizations think of actors as your Cozy Bears or APT 33 or what have you. But when we talk about actors, it's really at the org level, right? So what are some attributes that characterize behaviors or capabilities into a group that might be targeting your organization? Those could be things like, okay, we just did a threat hunt that has these 4 IOCs or these characteristics of a specific actor. Maybe it's a low-level actor, right? It doesn't have to be a nation state. It doesn't have to be an APT group, but it's something specific to our organization. And as you probably see on the screen, verdicts, related infrastructure, and actors, they're not new, right? But oftentimes they're siloed. And so what we've done is developed a framework to kind of use these as a way to interact with each other and piggyback off of the different elements of infrastructure that we have knowledge of or that we can gain knowledge of. And one of the survey findings that I thought was interesting was around structured tracking of a threat. And this is just that, right? Using a VRA framework is a way to kind of track a threat, whether it's the verdicts of an IOC, whether it's related infrastructure in terms of, okay, these IP addresses all resolve to, or these domains resolve to this specific IP address, which also is hosting C2 infrastructure as an example, and just being able to have that visibility into the other side of the attack, in terms of infrastructure. So leveraging infrastructure knowledge, what does that even mean? Or what are some things you can do from a threat hunting perspective, whether it's as an individual threat hunter or as you start to build out more of a mature process or methodology? One thing that I believe you need to have, and I think this was touched on a little bit within the survey, is unique data that derives from different types of sources. So when we say authoritative, we mean coming from the source itself. So think of it as a primary source of data versus a secondary source or an aggregated source of data, but then also commercially available and then open source. So authoritative could come from, for example, a registrar themselves, right? So being able to actually gather telemetry and data from a domain registration or registrar themselves would be considered authoritative data. A commercial set of data, of course, right? Passive DNS, something that vendors are really keen on aggregating and providing in terms of different feeds or intelligence offerings, and then open source. But having a good mix of those is key in leveraging infrastructure knowledge. And then not just the sources of data, but what types of data are you actually do you have access to? So when you are, and John mentioned DNS, right? We love DNS at Hyas. It's a great place to threat hunt. There's a lot of things that, a lot of security professionals just don't realize that you can find in DNS. And as you can see here, complementary data sets like DNS data, host posture data, malware, geolocation data, C2, JARM, right? All of these individually obviously have their own unique advantages and disadvantages. But when you start to pair those together and start to leverage those to pivot off of one another and the different relationships and patterns that are visible in those types of data sets, it becomes a really great way to leverage that infrastructure knowledge. Another thing around, or another aspect, is context and pivotability. So coming from my SOC background, and I'm sure many of you on the webinar agree, right? Context is king. A DNS log might mean something different based on the context, right? The type of environment, where it's coming from, the endpoint, the network it's on, right? So all of these different aspects in terms of being able to add context to what you're looking at is really key in terms of understanding the infrastructure side of the house. And then being able to pivot, whether this is through tools, whether this is through homegrown processes or internal methodologies and processes around the kind of the workflow and the logic that you should take as a threat hunter. That's really key. One, because if we have a less mature staff or knowledgeable security team, which many of us do, having those methodologies kind of built out to provide playbooks, run books for threat hunters to pivot off of data sets is really key in terms of speed, accuracy, and outcomes. And one of the things that we saw in the survey about adapting techniques by hunters, right, really resonated with me, because a lot of times in the organizations I've been a part of, the threat hunting has been more ad hoc. But as we start to generate tons of more data, both internally on the network as well as externally from the infrastructure side of threat actors, it's we need to make sure that we have those elements taken care of. So we're going to jump into a couple of use cases here. One is what I call, this is something that I investigated myself and was doing some threat hunting on internal to Hyas, what we call courtesan. So this is a cybercrime gang operating out of various countries in Africa, conducting business email compromise attacks, targeting real estate industry, among others. Some of the TTPs, they were using weaponized Office 365 Excel spreadsheets, and then utilizing typo squatting and domain lookalikes to essentially phish would-be victims. So one of the interesting aspects or pieces of telemetry that we were able to uncover was hosted domains on malicious infrastructure. So they were looking to hide in the noise in terms of the IOCs or the IP addresses that all of these domains were registered to. These IPs were also associated with other types of malicious activity. As you can see up there, that .207 IP address hosted out of the United Kingdom. In a lot of the telemetry and data that we were utilizing to actually threat hunt, as you can see, whois, passive DNS, siege attribution data, malware detonations, those all had association to this IP address. Now, what I was able to do is uncover through some whois data, and what I talked about around authoritative data from a registrar, being able to uncover the email address that was used to register 823 domains. What this allowed me to do is then be proactive in understanding where these threat actors were targeting next. And I actually started seeing patterns in terms of not only targeting the real estate industry, but based on new domain registrations that we know are tied to those same registration-based details, targeting now, heavy equipment and operational technology type of companies, right? OT environments. So you can start to see a shift in where these threat actors were targeting based on the IOCs that we were then monitoring from the infrastructure side. So courtesan in terms of mapping to the VRA, right? So verdicts, we uncovered malicious IPs and domains, malware families within that infrastructure associated with Agent Tesla and InfoStealer, and of course, business email compromise attacks used to gain entry into those specific environments. Related infrastructure, right? 825 domain registered using the same registration details. Now, of course, that could have been multiple threat actors or a group of threat actors, but having those similarities and those patterns allows you to then make predictions or threat hunt additional or create additional hypotheses off of the IOCs that you have. And then actors, right? In terms of profiling those specific actors located in Africa based on device geolocation data that we were able to pivot off of, using UK infrastructure and then using unique domains, right, to closely related to targeted victims. Prospero, this is a use case that is actually, as of recent, an ASN block or an ASN identified as Russian-based bulletproof hosting tied to malicious activity, targeting global organizations, again, in the financial industry. Now, interestingly enough, the financial industry or the FI that we were working with in terms of threat hunting for this specific use case was a pretty large global entity. However, their ability to stop this threat actor then falls downstream to a lot of the things we talked about around not having enough resources to go after certain threat actors. But based on what we saw in the telemetry and the data, they were also targeting other FIs downstream or maybe in the small to mid-size market. Some of the TTPs targeting business clients of financial institutions, they were actually using livechat.exe. What this threat actor failed to realize is that livechat.exe actually logs the IP addresses that are being or that are communicating with that specific application. So capturing and grabbing those IP addresses, as you can see in the IOC list there, off of the machines, and then using geolocation data to actually understand where those are located. These threat actors were actually operating out of the UK, and targeting a lot of different organizations in the UK, but also using various net blocks within this ASN to target other geographic entities. So, for example, a couple of IP addresses in that /24 were actually being used to target Italian companies. So it's interesting when you start looking at threat actor infrastructure and being able to really identify where threat actors might be operating from, whether they're targeting you as your organization or your industry and vertical, and where they might be moving next. Again, Prospero, the VRA here, verdicts, domain config history. We saw risky third-party infrastructure and name server reputation. That actually all came from DNS. So kind of going back to John's example of how DNS can be very useful. Related infrastructure, right? We saw net blocks associated with geographic targets. And then again, the actors here, it doesn't have to be Cozy Bear or some known, some well-known threat actor group located in the UK. And in this case, there's some of the TTPs were related to, possibly tied to Scattered Spider, if you guys are all familiar with that threat actor group. But what I wanted to leave you with here in terms of kind of some key takeaways is, again, that framework of VRA, because when you start to look at verdicts, related infrastructure, and actors as a whole, it really can lead you into predictive threat hunting. So where you can take some proactive threat intelligence, kind of start driving your operational resiliency and using VRA, when you start to mature your program into a more of an automated approach and feed, your incident response teams new data as they feed you IOCs. So I'll pause there. I'll stop here. And again, thank you guys for the time, and I'll hand it back over to Josh or Matt or our next presenter.
Yeah, so this time we agreed on who's going to introduce our next speaker, which would be Dave Bianco. So Dave Bianco has been around for a while in the threat hunting business. He's the inventor of the Pyramid of Pain that probably many of you know already. So he's basically a cowboy exploring unknown land in the threat hunting, and he now tells us how frameworks matter to do threat hunting in a structured way. Hey, Dave, nice to have you on.
Hey, thanks. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today, and thanks to Matt for that great Western themed introduction. Thanks also Josh and Matt for putting the survey together, and basically to everyone at SANS for having me on the webinar today. I appreciate it. So first of all, though, maybe I should say a little bit about myself. My name's David Bianco. As the slide says, I've been in cybersecurity for over 20 years. So mostly concentrating on blue team topics like incident detection, incident response, things that are closely aligned to those things like threat hunting. In fact, way back in 2015, 2016, I was the chief architect of what I think was the first published threat hunting methodology, the squirrel threat hunting model. These days, though, I work for Splunk's Surge cybersecurity research team, where I was fortunate enough to be able to update and expand on that work as the lead author of the Peak threat hunting framework. And all that is just to say that I have a pretty good amount of experience with threat hunting, which is why I found one aspect of the survey's results particularly surprising. Just to back up a little bit and set the stage, the survey data this year shows that everyone is hunting. I think like one important thing to keep in mind, though, is that almost exactly half of the respondents rated their hunting program's maturity as either mature or very mature. That's pretty good, actually. But if you look at it another way, it also means that half of the respondents didn't think that they were doing very well at hunting, rating themselves either maturing or immature. So while we've definitely made some progress, we still have some more work to do here. I also found it interesting that so many respondents lacked a defined methodology for threat hunting. Like as a serial framework author, that hit me right in the feels. Again, nearly half said that they either don't follow any particular methodology and they have no plans to do so, or they do have plans maybe, but haven't defined the methodology yet. So I kind of have a suspicion, like I have a strong suspicion that maybe these two groups of people, like those who are not yet mature in their hunting and those who don't follow a formalized methodology, I suspect they have a high overlap. That is, like, maybe they're not as mature as they could be because they're mired in ad hoc hunting processes and they constantly have to reinvent things as they go, maybe. That, though, wasn't the most surprising thing. I have to say, I was a little shocked to read that hunting seemed to have actually hurt some organizations' security postures. Like, fully 22.8% of the respondents reported a perceived decrease in their security readiness due to hunting. And that number jumps to 37.1% if you also include those who found no net change, which is still a decrease in my book, because if they weren't getting anything out of hunting, they could have used those resources on something else that would have given them a better return. That is just astounding to me. Like, especially considering that I see threat hunting as one of the key drivers of continuous improvement across your entire security program, that is probably, by the way, the single biggest design principle that we baked into the Peak framework. I can understand that organizations who are reporting maybe only modest increases from hunting, but to see like over a third of the respondents reporting that hunting actually made things worse or made no difference at all, I couldn't really figure that out at first. But then when I noticed the possible correlation between hunting maturity and the lack of hunting methodology, then I started to wonder, like maybe all three of these results are correlated. Like, is it possible that hunting without a defined framework could actually be worse than no hunting at all, at least in some cases? I don't know if I quite believe that, but I'll say it's certainly plausible. Like a methodology or a framework like Peak is designed to help you establish reliable, efficient, repeatable processes. And all of these things are things that help promote positive outcomes. Like a good framework does a lot for you. It'll show you things like what type of hunts exists, how to perform each type in detail, and how to choose which type or maybe types best fit your specific hunting use cases. So it's easy to see really why adopting a framework could help you get more success out of your threat hunting. Another thing I wondered about that result, though, was whether the responses were even true. Like the survey simply just asked respondents to estimate the improvement to security in percentage points. But I know from experience that a lot of organizations don't actually track security improvement from hunting, which I realize is a little bit at odds with one of the other results reported this year. But even those who do don't usually report it as percentages. So I wasn't quite sure how much credibility I should give that result in the first place. So remember when I said that one of the biggest design principles for Peak was that hunting should drive security improvement across your entire program? Well, the question of how to measure hunting success has always been a big one. It was probably like the number one or maybe number two question that I've got about hunting over the years. Like just because you hunted for something and didn't find it, that doesn't mean you failed. In fact, it's probably a good thing when you have evidence that threat actors are not doing something on your network. I never really felt like I had a good answer for hunting metrics, though, until Peak. That's because Peak actually defines success as your hunting having a positive impact on security. And once we realized that, then we were able to design a set of basic metrics that would help you demonstrate how your hunting program is making things better, like across the board. We provide in Peak a starting set of metrics for things like improvements to automated detection, visibility gaps or vulnerabilities that you found, and other things that kind of help you tell the story of not just how hard you're working, but what effect your poking around in things while you're threat hunting is having on security, like again, across the board. So back to the topic of methodology, though, one of Peak's key features is that not only does it define 3 types of hunts that you can do, we call them hypothesis-driven, baseline, and then the AI or ML-driven model-assisted threat hunting or MATH approach. But Peak also lays out detailed step-by-step processes for each one of those hunt types. And the one here on the screen is the hypothesis-driven type, which I think most people especially on this call right now, are probably pretty familiar with. So I won't go through each step box by box, though we do have those details in the framework document. Like really, what I just wanted to point out is what I think of as one of the most overlooked parts of threat hunting. And that is, hunting is not just the data analysis piece. There's a substantial amount of preparation and planning that goes into making a successful hunt, as well as a certain amount of like documentation and other follow-up tasks involved in integrating what you learned into the rest of the security program, turning your new hunting insights into actual tangible improvements in security. Each type of hunt in Peak has this same consistent 3-phase structure with separate prepare, execute, and act stages that encourages hunters to allocate time not just for the fun analysis piece, but also the planning and the follow-up actions that they need to ensure success. Also, each phase involves some measure of knowledge, which could be like threat intelligence and technique research in the prepare phase, asset information or local business process context, even security incidents in the execute phase, and things like hunt process documentation, stakeholder reports, and stuff like that in the act phase follow-ups. That three-phase structure turned out to be so important that we actually ended up naming the whole framework after it. PEAK stands for Prepare, Execute, and Act with Knowledge. Now, I know I've been talking a lot about PEAK, so let me bring it back to the survey. There were some surprises in there for me, mostly about hunting maturity, methodologies, especially perceived decreases in security readiness due to hunting. I don't know for sure, but I think that these all may be correlated. By adopting a framework that gives you a repeatable set, an efficient set of processes and provides more concrete measures of success, you can both improve your maturity level and ensure that you're actually getting substantial security improvements in return for all your hard work. PEAK has proven to be very popular since we introduced it last year. If you'd like to learn more about this, it's a free platform product agnostic threat hunting framework. You can use it whether you're a Splunk customer or not. Check out the QR code on the screen, and I will also drop some links into the discussion just shortly. PEAK was still pretty new when Matt and Josh started this year's survey, but we managed to get a few shout outs in not only the survey results itself, the report, but also a bunch of you respondents actually mentioned PEAK. So thank you very much. I appreciate that. I hope that next year when the SANS threat hunting survey for 2025 comes out, we'll actually see a lot more organizations adopting it, or at least something like it, some framework, and thus more programs rating themselves as mature, and of course a lot fewer, I hope, organizations with perceived security decreases.
Okay, thank you very much for that, David. And you're right. I can kind of give a small insight into some of the data when we start to slice it up. That those who don't have a formal or do have an ad hoc type methodology are usually the ones that struggle to either determine what their metrics rating is, or provide a metrics rating, or see backwards drop in sort of their overall, I guess, sort of security increase in the organization. We have kind of looked at some of that data, and we do run into some challenges with being able to represent some of it, because there are some questions that don't let you progress past a certain point if you say no to some questions. But you are definitely down the right path. Those who don't have a methodology to kind of stick to really kind of struggle with this challenge. As you mentioned, we did do a bit of a call out to PEAK this year in the survey, which was nice. We got that in there, but it's nice to see sort of these methodologies come about for threat hunting. I mean, it is, in fairness, things like cybersecurity and incident response and threat hunting are all relatively new industries that have not existed for as long as something like medicine. So having these new methodologies and frameworks come out is just one way of trying to increase people's capabilities and also give them something to measure as well. So that's so definitely have a look at PEAK for those of you who haven't heard about it before. It is definitely something to sort of watch and take a look at it and see if that will work for your organization and your team as well, or even if that's something that you can start to push your outsourcing provider potentially to potentially utilize for you as a customer. Okay, with that, we kind of move on to our panel session. So it's a bit of an open question. I might kind of rotate the responses around a little bit. So we might go the same order that we went with presenters. So we might go John, Adam, and then David, and then we'll kind of rotate around for the next question. So our first question is, What are the big cybersecurity concerns pertaining to threat hunting and global vulnerabilities that you're hearing from CEOs or CISOs or the C-suite essentially, and IT professionals as we start to go into 2024? So I'll kind of hand it over to you first, John, if you want to let us know kind of what you're hearing from that sort of group.
Sure. I'll give you a single and specific answer. Ransomware, which we've talked about a little bit in this presentation and session today. You mentioned, I think it was you, Josh, you or Matt mentioned about how the adversaries are starting to switch up their tactics, right? Because backups are now more common, which is great. The effectiveness of basically locking your disks and demanding Bitcoin to get the decryption key, less effective these days. And so what we're seeing increasingly, and what we're hearing from customers, CISOs alike, is the game is shifting on ransomware, and they're more focused now on data exfiltration and then holding that data hostage outside the organization and threatening to leak it, whether that's sensitive, personal information or protected IP, right? In all sorts of industries, pharmaceutical, software, et cetera. Which is good and bad, right? For the defenders. Good that we've shifted them off of their classic disrupt organizations, take everybody offline for 5 days. You can't open your laptop. That's good. Bad because they're still at it, and this data exfiltration piece can have similar impact. The good news, I think, for threat hunting here is that type of ransomware attack, in my opinion, it increases surface area potential to discover what's going on, because they have to take a couple more steps to get the data out of your organization, right under your nose, which, if it's a large amount of data, can be done, but increases their exposure risk to discovery. And there's a whole series of things that happen before that event as well that gives you as a threat hunter like potential to catch them in the act. Difficult, but it's a little different than everything's encrypted. They encrypted your disks and now you're screwed. They have to do a little more work now, and it increases the time that they have to be in your environment, I believe. And we've seen some evidence of that from some of our customers, which is cool.
Yeah, that's right. And also, I guess the challenge of being able to do things like track that when it's inside of like M365 sitting in the cloud, and then they just exfil it all out and are happy with the speed that they'll get straight from Microsoft's cloud to be able to pull that out, and then being able to actually monitor that type of activity as it occurs too. Nice. I like that one. What about over to you, Adam? What are you kind of hearing from those groups around sort of what are kind of the interesting things to go threat hunting for, or these kind of like new vulnerabilities that there might be challenges going into this year?
Yeah, and it's funny because I wish I could say it's something different than what I've said in the last 3 or 4 or 5 years, but it's the same thing, honestly. And it's ransomware, phishing, business email compromise attacks, lack of network visibility for remote workers, right? When they have EDR on the endpoints at home, but they don't have network telemetry because they're not always on the network. And so, what I found interesting though is based upon who I'm talking to, the context and level of priority or severity changes when you talk about those threats, but they're always the same threats, right? So I was talking to a CISO just the other week at a conference around attribution, threat actor attribution. And they're like, we're not really interested in that because we're not really a target of nation states, but we're still concerned about ransomware as a service from these low level, threat actors that are going to come after us. So I just, it's funny. It's the same threats that we're seeing, and which is why we're trying to look at different ways of doing things, because obviously there's a change that needs to be had. And then of course that human element will, in my opinion, that human element will always leave vulnerability for those types of threats. And no matter how good your security is, there's always going to be that human error or human element that is going to leave that vulnerable space, which is really what, how can we change that? How can we adapt moving forward? But yeah, those are the things that I've been hearing as of late.
Yeah, and that concept of an individual inside the organization just making a config mistake and mistakenly like exposing something that they shouldn't is so simple to do as well. So someone being able to make that mistake and not realize it, and then a threat actor kind of scan the edge of the network and be like, all right, we've like got this kind of unprotected RDP all of a sudden straight into the environment. This could be bad news. But you're right. Like even like that's kind of an old issue that has existed for a long period of time that is still current today. Nice. And what about on your side, David? What are you kind of hearing from these different groups as well on what things are kind of a concern for this year?
Yeah, I think usually when I'm out talking to our customers about threat hunting, the biggest things are not specific threats, but they want to know, like they're not coming to me and say, yeah, we are really concerned about hunting for this or whatever. They actually come to me and they say, how should I know what should I be hunting for? And because I realized in the survey we said like BEC and ransomware are the two big ones. To me, like if you're hunting for ransomware, you have gone seriously wrong, because research, including research from my own team, shows that once the ransomware actors are in your environment, your window for actually doing anything before they start to affect you is very small, like minutes, right? So you need automated detection for that. Similar, maybe not the same degree, but same for business email compromise. Usually what I tell them though is what you need to be hunting for varies by organization, but what you should do is have a hunting strategy of how you enumerate what you could be hunting for and prioritize it. Even something simple like, oh, I'm going to hunt for things that affect my technology stack and are, start at the right end of the cyber kill chain, like the things farther into the life cycle, and then work your way to the earlier parts of the life cycle.
Yeah, that's exactly right, and that's kind of a I mean, it's something that we hear all the time around, like, you're exactly right. Like, where do we go threat hunting? Like, start at the right-hand side where things have gone really, really wrong, and then move back the other way is kind of a good place to go looking for that. You are very right. It's interesting that people kind of say that they went hunting for ransomware. I guess, and also to a degree, interesting that people. Well, I guess we asked them what they found more than anything else, which was kind of interesting to see where that went. There were also, fortunately, like a lot of other kind of responses, but they were all kinds of like small individual responses, which kind of fall into that other category that we give a little bit more detail on as well. But it also interesting section to kind of see this year, which we hadn't kind of published in previous years either. So it might be interesting to kind of expand that out a little bit further and see where we go with that one. I might hand over to you, Matt, if you want to run the next question.
Yeah, if my connection keeps stable, I'm gonna give it a shot. So the next question that is a very interesting one, at least for me as someone working for an outsourcing provider as well. Have you seen any specific drawbacks of outsourcing your threat hunting to a third party? And also, what kind of outsourcing arrangement is something that you consider working well and not working so well? Regarding like full outsourcing, or you work together with the people there. I think, Adam, you are the next in line, right?
Sure. Yeah, I'll say for the clients that we work with, we don't typically see a lot of full outsourcing of threat hunting, and mainly it's due to the reasons that you guys mentioned earlier, right? And what some of the results in the survey discussed. What I will say is we do see a lot of kind of collaboration efforts when it comes to more of like threat hunting services. So working alongside an internal threat hunting team, but bringing in expertise in certain domains or specific areas where maybe they might be lacking. So we work with like a large credit card provider that does just that, where they have an internal team that's really versed on like the credit card enumeration and fraud aspect of cyber. But then when they have some more kind of very specific cyber type of threat hunts, they definitely bring in our team. And I've seen that across multiple organizations. Typically, though, it's when when you're a little bit larger and mature and you have those resources and budget to actually have an internal threat hunting team. But I would say even down mid-market and those that maybe don't have specific threat hunting teams, I personally wouldn't recommend, even as a vendor, right? I wouldn't recommend outsourcing your threat hunting 100%, because I've been on the other side of it. I've been in SOC operations where you're relying on those vendors or those solutions and those threat intelligence feeds or whatever it might be, but no one knows your network like you do. And so I think, in my opinion, it would be some type of hybrid approach where you're using a set of services from a vendor and maybe their solution as well, but kind of blending that into your own methodologies and kind of, hunting program.
Yeah, I would totally agree to that, because then you have the people knowing the network, but not the hunting not so well, and you have the people who know how to hunt, right? Would be the
Right.
best combination, at least theoretically. Dave, you're next. So what's your experience?
Actually, it's just very similar to what Adam said. I think you're right. I usually tell people that threat hunting itself is a skill that you need to develop, and you need to bring people into your threat hunting, like maybe not your threat hunting team, like the full-time threat hunters if you have them, or the threat hunting function, but the party of people that are actually doing threat hunting for a specific hunt. You should have people who know threat hunting as a skill, but also people who have all that localized business and IT knowledge from your organization. That is true, by the way, even if you're doing hunting totally in-house, right? People from your SOC or your IT management, or even other parts of your IT organization that have specialized skills, put them in with some people that have practiced the art of hunting, and set them to a hunting task for a couple of weeks. If you're thinking about a vendor, like, I can't really tell you, uh, you should or should not think about outsourcing threat hunting. I think it makes sense for some organizations, and maybe it makes less sense for others. But if you are going to do that kind of outsourcing, I think you really should try to find a vendor who's willing to work with you, because you can't effectively hunt in an environment that you are not really familiar with. So being able to partner with their clients is a key function for a successful, like, MSSP or threat hunting outsource provider.
Yeah, otherwise you end up like in incident response, where you constantly need to ask the client how their
Yep.
network looks like, what a certain machine does, and so on.
Is this
Same for
normal
hunting.
for your environment?
Yeah. Unfortunately, often when it's not normal for you, it's normal for them, right?
But yeah, I mean, if you look hard enough, there's abnormal things everywhere, and you have to. I realize I'm about to sound like Donald Rumsfeld. You need to find the abnormal things, and not the normal abnormal things.
That's a good quote there. John, what's your take on that?
Plus one to what both of the previous speakers said, and I'll add something too about, like, we've seen some great third-party threat hunters. We've had the privilege of working with some of them, and there's some incredible talent out there. And if you've got the budget to do some outsourcing and it's not going to happen in-house otherwise, go for it. And hybrid too is great, especially because you can marry context with outside skill. One thing I'll just add is, I think this was something you were talking about, David. One of the benefits of keeping threat hunting in-house wherever you can is there are so many downstream second order benefits that you can derive from it that are maybe not self-evident, right? Like, if you are threat hunting, and you're also an incident responder, right, during your day job, you will be a better incident responder, because you will, through threat hunting, learn your environment better and be able to triage faster, make sense of things, connect dots that, right, if you're just staring at an alert queue all day, might not be evident, because you're given the freedom to go out and sign a poke and prod and understand detection engineering, right? If you're looking at that as a capability, like, there's this threat hunting isn't this like activity that should live off in the ether as its own thing. It's a beautiful cycle that feeds on itself and improves itself if you work it into your SOC, because it makes everything else better in the process. You can start tuning alert technology better once you're like, hey, we discovered something really weird over here, which would explain why this particular tool keeps firing in this way. Hey guys, can we tune it down, right? We've literally seen conversations like that happen. So that's just kind of, there are ancillary benefits to threat hunting that improve your entire organization, that if you can bring it in-house wherever possible, you can gain those benefits.
Yeah,
Yeah, one thing
absolutely. It's a really great way to do skills and knowledge transfer within your security team too, when they're working together on the same hunt.
Yeah, one thing I was
That's
going to add, if I could, based off what John just mentioned, is when I was in a SOC as an analyst, it was very rigid, right? So it was, oh, I think there's something I should threat hunt. Give it to the threat hunting team. But to your point, John, I think nowadays there's an element of threat hunting in every security professional every security, position that exists, and there probably should be for those reasons that you just mentioned. So, and I think there was touched in the survey a little bit about IR becoming more of a feedback loop for threat hunting. Now, when I talk to SOCs, a lot of the analysts are doing threat hunting themselves. It might be ad hoc. It might not be so much of a, programmatically, right? But yeah, to your point, there should be an element of that in probably everything we do as security professionals, because it's so valuable, and it's not seen as so much of it's over here on the side anymore. It really should be a kind of a, a benchmark of your entire program.
And I guess to kind of add on to that question and those answers that you've all kind of given there, like you've all talked about the huge benefits that there are with kind of doing that threat hunting internally. I guess given that we have seen such a big shift this year in the results of people actually outsourcing it, and it's not, I guess to add a little bit of context to this question as well, it's not just around a shared outsource. We did see a drop in those that were doing sort of the hybrid model, that were basically doing some external consultants and some internal. That had also dropped this year, but those which now are fully outsourced, which is a little over a third of respondents. What do you think has caused such a big shift all of a sudden, given that we were seeing that trend downwards over the last couple of years, and all of a sudden to see that spike this year? Is there anything that that I guess the three of you kind of think may have caused this kind of shift in change of outsourcing threat hunting, given the significant benefits that you're all kind of talking about there? We might start with you this time, David.
Yeah, I honestly, I don't know. Partly it could just be that people are more, like, organizations are more acknowledging that they need some sort of threat hunting going on. And they're, a lot of times when I talk to an organization, even ones have been doing threat hunting for a long time, but especially when they're starting out, they want to know, like, are they doing it the right way? Or is there a better way? Or how do they get started? Like, even organizations who know they should be doing it, they seem a little bit tentative at first to get started. So I don't know, maybe the outsourcing piece could be explained a little bit by, like, organizations knowing that they need to do it, but are not entirely sure how to get started, or maybe they're unsure if they have the resources to do it themselves. And so it's kind of like, maybe they're thinking that it's an easy button. Like, I can write a check and bang, we have threat hunting next week.
Yeah,
I don't.
that's true. Possible. Yeah. Nice. I like that theory. What about on your side, John? What do you think, or have you heard anything that might be kind of influencing this kind of large shift to using an outsourced provider for it?
Yeah, I think as with all things in the world, there are probably multiple variables at play. I think David's case is pretty convincing. I also think a factor could probably just be the macroeconomics that are happening right now. Companies at all industries have been going through layoffs, rolling layoffs now for many quarters in a row, and I've seen some very talented security folk that I know, like, impacted by some of these layoffs at organizations. And I think we might be seeing some evidence of just classic corporate behavior in tighter economic conditions, which is outsourcing becomes a lot more interesting to the management layer in the business.
Yeah, for sure. And it was definitely something that Matt and I were kind of hypothesizing on. Although it is a little hard to kind of add much of a response into the report when we don't have sort of hard data to kind of support that from respondents as well. And what about from your side, Adam? What do you kind of think might be influencing this?
Yeah, I think there's a number of things at play. One thing that I think is interesting, especially from the survey around, CISOs being more involved in the build out, right, of methodologies and strategy around threat hunting. And I can't remember exactly where I read the statistic, but I think as of today, like, the majority of CISOs have been in their role for 2 years or less. So I think there's a lack of just experience, right? And they're trying to understand, well, how do I build that? Because maybe they were a threat hunter from the technical side, but now you've got the strategic business side of it that you really have to deal with. But I also think, in coming from the, MSSP space, we're seeing a resurgence of that as well, where threat hunting is, quote unquote, like, added in as a service, right? Whatever that means, right? In terms of what an MSSP does. And if you think back to last year, I mean, it was a really pivotal point for cybersecurity where it's the first time we saw individuals going to jail, right? CISOs going to jail. So I think there's a lot of risk transference right now. One, because we're immature, right? We have immature organizations that don't have, leadership that have been in those roles for very long. Not that they're not skilled technically and have the background, but they and there's risk transference. I don't want to go to jail if I'm a CISO, right? So let's transfer that to a third party, or whether it's an MSP or some vendor that we can transfer that risk to. So I think those things are really big at play, along with some of the other things that both the other presenters mentioned.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And it could also be part combinations of everything you've kind of mentioned, like even with the concept of a lot of people using things like EDR or outsourcing EDR and XDR. It could also be that vendor now knows the environment as well as what an internal person could be in. And so they're kind of giving that to a third party to do threat hunting, and then partly because that is a financial benefit because maybe they're already paying for that service, so they'll just roll it in there. And then also, I like the concept around kind of transferring risk as well. That's kind of another one which would be obviously extremely attractive to a lot of CISOs that could be very concerned. Nice. I'll hand it back to Matt.
Yeah, so there's one question I think that's very specific, specifically directed at you, Dave, and that is if you have any specific tools to use Peak. I guess it's a little bit about documentation, setting that up. Is there anything?
Yeah, so I guess one thing to know about Peak is that we specifically designed it to not care about what tools or platforms or anything, right? First of all, I just wanted to avoid it being tied to a specific security product, right? But also, I know that like if I tied it to any tool, no matter how great that tool is, like the majority of people that could benefit from Peak would not have that tool. And so don't use tools. We do talk a little bit about classes of tools when especially when we talk about documentation. So I would say things like, our ACT phase has a lot of things like how to document your hunts for your own hunt team's future use. Things like we put our codes in like GitHub repos so we could reuse it if we need it. We have wiki pages that document the hunts and stuff like that people use. You might not be using the exact same tool set, but odds are very good that you have access to source code repository kind of stuff. You have access to shared knowledge bases. It might not be a wiki, maybe it's SharePoint or something like that. But so it's less about the tools. Like I'm a SANS instructor, so when we as you are, right? And when we talk about our class, one of the first things I say in the first day is I'm here not to teach you tools. Tools are important to do things, but if you understand what you're supposed to be doing and why you're supposed to be doing it and when you're supposed to be doing it, you'll adapt to the tools. And I think it's the same in threat hunting. So we don't have anything to say about what tools you should or should not be using in Peak, just sometimes the classes of tools that we might recommend if you are not, you don't have something already set up for that.
That is actually a good lead over when it comes to understanding tools and everything. And that question goes to Adam next. So it's regarding AI and ML in tools. Do you see that being adopted in threat hunting a lot? And if so, how? Is it successful?
Yeah, so good question. Yes, we are starting to see that. And actually, Highest published a piece of a POC last year called Black Mamba, AI generated polymorphic malware. So I do think that the human is not going to go away, but the threat hunting techniques and strategies are going to change. So it's first understanding what AI is actually doing. So how is AI changing the game, or how is it adapting to some of the new threats that it's generating or creating? I think that'll change the way we threat hunt those specific types of threats. I still think it's pretty early on, and interestingly enough, right, you go to these conferences and everybody's got AI on their banner now, which Yeah, I think it's just the next buzzword, to be honest with you. There's some really great research and innovation happening around AI, but I still think we're a little bit of a ways off in terms of um, we're seeing it kind of live. I mean, there's definitely a lot of interesting aspects, but I do think it's going to change the way we threat hunt, both programmatically and from the human element. Um, but there's still so much up in the air in terms of what AI even means and the type of AI and whether it's generative or not. So I think there's still a lot to be said there. But yes, we are starting to see that. We aren't seeing a lot of it from our clients in terms of asking around, about it, but more so from security researchers and practitioners and companies starting to do a lot more around what is it going to look like? How do we get in front of it? And then putting out POCs like we did with Black Mamba so that other researchers and other threat hunters can start to grasp, their heads around what that might entail from a threat hunting perspective.
Cool. Thank you very much. John, you've got pretty much the last word after we wrap up.
Sure.
What's your take on AI?
I'll talk about the defender perspective here. Certainly, I'm concerned about offensive uses of these tools. In particular, I think phishing and pretexting is going to get so much more dangerously better. But on the defender side, we actually have seen some experimentation across some of our customers with these tools. And one customer in particular kind of inspired us to actually build product capability into our product. But what this customer was doing is they were, their team, their SOC was just out there experimenting with these new large language model tools that are out there and using them as kind of workflow acceleration, bouncing ideas off of them, right? And specifically, right, I'll give you an example, right? Like I was using some of these tools to experiment with them as well in the early days when they first came out. And you can ask these tools something like, hey, I have a lot of DNS traffic. What are 3 different ways I could be being attacked on DNS right now? And these tools generally give you pretty good answers. Some of these tools can even go deeper and you can say, great, that second thing that you just told me about, what types of specific activities and behaviors would I be looking for that type of a thing? It'll tell you. Some of these tools can even go a step further. And for well-documented tools like Splunk, for example, some of these tools are capable of like crafting Splunk queries for you that, test them, check them, don't put any sensitive company information into these tools. But that's a pretty cool thing because if you're a more junior analyst, it's sort of like having a bit of a more senior analyst sitting on your shoulder and saying like, hey, look here, or here's how this would work, or here's an example. And it can be really helpful for people in their learning journey. Check your sources, right? These things are capable of hallucinations, but a customer of ours was doing things like that and talking to us about how their team was using it. And we were like, okay, we think maybe we could build a product capability around it. So we're definitely starting to see experimentation. It's exciting.
That's cool. And I think you're exactly right. Like any tool that helps us as defenders do our job faster and quicker, like that is a huge gain for us. Whether it is things like threat hunting, being able to find those threats quicker inside the environment with threat hunting, or just doing response type of work like you're kind of describing there, being able to like get ahead of the threat actor faster because they move through the environment faster. So we kind of have to move faster as well. And if there's things that will help us do that, like that's a huge benefit. Look, I want to do a big thank you to David, John, and Adam for being here today and to presenting and also being on the firing line of the panel session at the end, which is always wonderful. I know it's always a little bit interesting to see what questions we get and kind of answering those off the cuff. But thank you all very much for that. And for everyone else that joined today, I just want to thank you all as well for listening in and please take the time to go and read the full report. Matt and I have put a lot of love and care into that report and tried to really pull out as much of the metrics as we can from the survey results that people have sent in to us, and also those who actually provided results as part of the survey went out as well. We are hugely beneficial to your information and everything you kind of provide in that overall survey, because we take that and then we try to provide that back as useful as possible to the rest of the industry. So go and download that now. I know they've posted a number of links in the Zoom session and in the Slack room as well. If you have any questions that we didn't get a chance to answer today, please feel free to drop them into Slack. It'd be great if it's directed at one particular person. Please make sure you mention them just so you grab their attention. I know there's a lot of questions in there. Other than that, we thank you all very much for dialing in, and I'll hand it back to you, Mary Lynn.
Thank you so much, Matt, Josh, David, John, and Adam for your great presentation, and to Carbon Black, Cisco, Corelight, Cyborg Security, Hyas, Lacework, Rapid7, and Splunk for sponsoring this webcast, which helps to bring this content to the SANS community. To our audience, we greatly appreciate you listening in. For a schedule of all upcoming and archived SANS webcasts, including this one, please visit sans.org/webcasts. Until next time, take care, and we hope to have you back again for the next SANS webcast.